All right, well, good morning, everyone. My name's Kyle. I don't know about you, but one of my favorite things in life is stories. All right, I love stories. I love hearing stories. I love listening to stories. I love reading stories. I love movies that have good stories within the plot. If the movie, even if it has all the great effects and great acting, if the story is not all that compelling, for me, it's kind of a waste of time. Stories are so powerful for us, for our culture, for our families, for our children. My kids, they often ask for me to tell them stories. And we have books that we read from, or I make up stories, and they are thrilled to be a part of these stories and to hear these stories because stories are so formative. Stories are powerful. They shape cultures. They shape personalities. They give us hope for the future. G.K. Chesterton, who is a famous author, talking about fairy tales, he says this. He says, "Fairy tales do not tell children dragons exist. Children already know that dragons do not exist. Fairy tales tell children that the dragons can be killed." Right? So for him, saying there's power in stories because it gives us hope. It tells children, yeah, there's no such thing as dragons. However, what you come up against in this life can be conquered in the same way that dragons are conquered in the fairy tales. So if we think about stories and we read the scriptures as the ultimate story, and as we work our way through from Genesis through Exodus, Leviticus, through the prophets, the Psalms, and by the time we come to Mark, what we find is that this story has been developed. And then Mark is a master storyteller, right? He is a master storyteller. And in his gospel, he weaves stories together, he weaves themes together, and he does this for our benefit. It's not only a historical account of who Jesus is and what he has done. It is that, but it is also a story. And that story is one that we are to identify with. So as we work through this gospel, I hope and pray that you will remember this story of the Gospel of Mark. Not just the one we're in this morning, but overall, what is Mark telling us? What are the narratives that he's weaving together, and what is the story of Jesus Christ? And I hope that as we work through it for the coming months and so on, that you will become so familiar with this story that it becomes, in a real way, part of your story as well. So last week, we talked about the man who was possessed by a legion of demons. He lived among the tombs. He lived in a world of death. He slept next to dead people's bones. He lived in a culture of death. Everything about this man told us that he is surrounded by death. He was experiencing spiritual death by the demonic powers. And he was a representation of death itself, needing to be rescued, needing to be raised to life. And that's exactly what Jesus did. Jesus goes into this dark graveyard, and he frees this man from the loneliness of being exiled from the city, living by himself. He freed this man of the demonic powers that controlled him. And he freed this man from having to live among the tombs. And he sent this man out, and he told him to go tell the story. Go tell everybody in the 10 cities what I have done for you. And Mark is very strategic when he tells us this story because Jesus was on a boat going from the west side of the Sea of Galilee to the east side to rescue this man and tell him to go tell the story of what I've done for you. And now Jesus gets back in his boat and heads back to the west side of the Sea of Galilee, probably Capernaum, but we're not positive. It doesn't tell us exactly where he lands on the west side, but he gets back into the boat and heads over. So now, in this story, having freed this man from the culture and the slavery of death, he comes back and he gets out of the boat, and a great crowd comes to be around him. So what Mark does in our passage this morning, which is Mark chapter 5, 21 through the end of the chapter. This is the story about Jairus' daughter and the woman with the issue of blood. And what Mark does in this passage is he has a sandwich. And we've talked about this before and how Mark will start with one story, he'll interrupt that story with another, and then come back and finish the original story. What Mark is doing here is he is weaving these two stories together in a powerful way. He is, in a sense, wrapping the story of the woman with the issue of blood with the story of Jairus and his daughter. All right, so he's bringing these two stories together to the point to which we can't really understand either one of the stories apart from the other. Mark intends for these stories to complement each other, to interpret each other. So he begins with Jairus. Jairus, and we see this in verse 21 and the following verses. Jairus now is a man who is a ruler of the synagogue. And he has a reputation of being a man of status, a man of privilege, a man who is to be respected. And we also know from the stories of Mark thus far that Jesus and the synagogue, they don't really get along very well, right? So this kind of adds a strange element to this beginning part with Jairus. So look with me at verse 21, and we'll read through verse 24, halfway through verse 24. And it says, "And when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side," now he's going back from the east side to the west side of the Sea of Galilee, it says, "a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea." Now, throughout Mark, great things happen when Jesus is beside the sea. This is a common reoccurrence, a common geographical location for Jesus to minister. Verse 22, "Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name. And seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him, saying, 'My little daughter is at the point of death. Come, lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live.' And he went with him." So imagine this scene. Jesus gets out of the boat, and this crowd is expecting him. They're excited to see him again. The miracle worker is back. So they all come in. And in this scene, Jairus, a panicked father, a man of stature and a man of reputation, comes running to Jesus in the middle of this crowd and falls down at Jesus' feet and says, "Please, I need your help. My daughter is dying. She is so sick. I need you to come and lay your hands on her so that she might be well and live." There is an urgency here. There is a desperation, as any father would know if their child was sick at the point of death and say, "I've got to save her. And I know Jesus. I've seen him. I know my friends in the synagogue, the scribes and the Pharisees, they don't like him, but I've seen him heal people. He is my only hope. He is my only hope." So he runs, forgetting about his reputation, forgetting about what people might think of him in his position as being a ruler, or maybe another way to think about it is the president of the synagogue. Forgetting all of that, with a reckless abandon, he runs to Jesus and falls at his feet because he knows, right? He knows that Jesus has the power to heal. He has the power to save. He knows that Jesus is the source of life. He knows that Jesus has the power to save his little girl, and he knows that there is something special about Jesus. So he comes to him and begs. And what a great example this is for us, right? That this man, no matter what people thought of him, knows that Jesus is the one that can save his little girl, and he goes straight to Christ. He knows this, and we know this as well. We know that Jesus is the one that brings healing to our lives. He's the one that brings healing to our city, to our families, to our culture, to our country. Yet, how often are we willing to run to him directly and saying, "Jesus, we need you"? Jairus goes on behalf of his daughter. And we are to follow that example and go to the feet of Jesus on behalf of other people. There are people who are unable to come to the feet of Jesus because they don't know him. So we are to run to Jesus on behalf of our friends, on behalf of our family, on behalf of politics, on behalf of whatever it might be. We are to run to Jesus on behalf of other people, as Jairus has done. We do this because we know, like Jairus knew, that hope is only found in Jesus. And this has become increasingly unpopular. At times, it's even considered insensitive or ill-timed when things happen and we say, you know what? Jesus is the answer. Say, man, why do you talk to me about this Jesus stuff? This is real life issues, right? I'm dealing with something serious right now. You know, I just lost my job and my kids are running away from God, and you want to just talk about Jesus. And for us, we want to say yes, because Jesus is the only one who brings peace, brings healing to this situation. Yet we need to be able to proclaim Jesus as he truly is, which is, again, why stories are so important, that we know who he is, right? Jesus is not a rabbit's foot or a good luck charm or a magic spell that we say, if we put a little Jesus on it, everything will be better. That's not the case. But the true Jesus, the Jesus that Mark gives us, the Jesus that the Gospels and the entire Bible gives us, this is a Jesus who enters into messy situations and brings hope. So here he comes, begging Jesus to go with him on behalf of his daughter, because Jairus knows that Jesus is his only hope. And Jesus goes with him. So imagine this sight now. Jesus says, okay, I'll go with you. And there's this big crowd around him. We see this in verse 24. And Jesus went with him, and a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. It says, pressing in, bumping, getting in the way. So imagine a panicked father saying, I know my girl is on the doorstep to death, and I need to get Jesus there in time. And this crowd is slowing you down. I could picture Jairus just pushing people out of the way and saying, come on, Jesus, come on. And he's panicked. He is agitated. He's frustrated, and he's concerned. And he only has one mission in his mind, to get Jesus to his daughter. So he's working his way through this crowd in this desperate state. And then something happens. Some woman reaches out and touches Jesus. And Jesus stops, and he turns around and said, who touched me? Now, could you imagine Jairus' state of mind at this point, right? He's saying, are you serious? You're going to stop because somebody touched you. My daughter is about to die. And his disciples had a similar reaction. We see this in verses 30 and 31. It says, and Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, who touched my garments? And his disciples said to him, you see this crowd pressing in around you, and yet you say, who touched me? This would be like a running back in football getting tackled, and all the linebackers jump on top of him, and he gets up and he says, who touched me? Like, everybody touched you. That's the point, right? This is what's going on here. Why are you asking this question? But Jesus stops everything to ask that question. Who touched me? And now everybody's kind of still, and I could just imagine the panic in Jairus' heart and mind, saying, oh my gosh, any minute now. And then this woman steps forward, and she owns it. Verse 33 says, but the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. Now, this is even worse for Jairus, because it's not just, oh, I'm the one that touched you. All right, let's go. No, this lady says, I did it, and now let me tell you the story. And Jesus is sitting there listening to this woman tell him the whole truth. So Jairus' anxiety now is at an all-time high, already hurried, already frustrated by the crowd, and now Jesus stops to chat with some woman who touches his robe. So who is this woman? Why does Mark put this in the story? Why does Mark include these things together and tells it in this way, in such a way that they must go together? So we see who this woman is. We get some background on her in verses 25 through 29. It says, "And there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard the reports about Jesus, and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, 'If I touch even his garment, I will be made well.' And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease." So this is the motivation, this is the background about this woman. This woman has suffered for 12 years by having a constant flow of blood. For 12 years, this woman has suffered physically. She has suffered socially. She has suffered financially. Right? Physically, for 12 years, she has been weak. She has been unable to do the normal things that a woman her age should be able to do because of this disease that just took all of her strength away. It would have affected her ability to work, to operate, to be able to serve, to live her life physically tormented by this disease. Not only that, but she suffered financially. The text says that she spent her last dollar on the physicians. She had gone to many doctors, many physicians, trying to figure out, what is wrong with me? It has affected her so much that she was willing to spend her last dime to try to be healed, looking for a cure. Yet, to no avail, right? It had not gotten any better. It only grew worse. So she is physically suffering. She is financially suffering. And socially, she was an outcast. Socially, she was kept away from people because she was ceremonially unclean, and anything that she would touch in the Jewish system at this time meant that that thing also became unclean. She was not allowed to go to the temple to worship or to the synagogue where Jairus was the president. Those two probably had never met because she, for at least 12 years, had not been in to the synagogue because she was unclean. She was unable to partake in the feasts of God's people. She was unable to enjoy the celebrations like the Passover and the Feast of Booths that would go on for days, and it would be a party, and people would be coming before God and singing praises, and she was not allowed to be part of that. That would be like for you if you had a sickness, not being able to celebrate your birthday or Christmas or Easter or any other holidays that you might like because of this sickness. Not being able to be with your friends and be in community. In a very real way, she kind of had the same life as the demon-possessed man, though without the demons, but all by himself. In fact, according to the Mosaic law, she was considered a dead person. Not physically dead, but ceremonially dead. So she was a walking dead woman for 12 years. In the same way that this man lived in the tombs, apart from community. So she needed help, and she had lost all of her money. She had lost all of her friends. If she was married at one point, more than likely she would have been divorced at this time. Her husband probably would have left her because of this. So the woman thinks to herself, I need healing. And she knows, like Jairus knew. She had heard the reports about Jesus. She had heard what he had done. And she reaches out to touch his garment with the confidence and the faith that if I can just touch his garments, I will be made well. She did not want to make a public ordeal about this, right? She did not stop Jesus and say, hey, I'm sick and I need you to heal me. She didn't come to Jesus like Jairus did and cast himself down and said, you have to come save my daughter. She just sneaks up behind him and tries to touch his garment. So clearly, I think that this woman did not understand the prophets, right? We could say, okay, theologically, this woman has some issues because if she had read the prophets, she would know that cleansing power never transfers over to somebody who is ceremonially unclean or ceremonially dead. It doesn't work that way. Death spreads, life does not. In fact, Haggai, he talks about this explicitly. God told Haggai to ask the priests of his day this question. In Haggai 2:12-13, says, this is Haggai asking the priest this question, if someone carries holy meat in the fold of his garment. Now, before we go much further, the fold of his garment, throughout the Old Testament, we find that this is oftentimes called the wings of the garment, all right? And this is because in the Old Testament, the priest had this angelic sort of position, right? As angels had wings, the priests had wings in their garments, and it was the folds that came down around their arms. Okay, so that's kind of important to think about when Haggai is talking about the fold of his garment. It is the wing of his garment. Now, if someone is carrying holy meat, sanctified, pure, clean meat in the fold or in the wing of his garment and touches with his fold bread or stew or wine or oil or any kind of food, does it become holy? So if he's carrying something holy in his garment and his garment touches something, does that thing become holy? And the priests answer correctly, no. No, it doesn't. Then Haggai said, if someone who is unclean by contact with a dead body touches any of these, does it become unclean? And they answer correctly. It says it does become unclean, yes. Because death spreads, holiness does not. So this woman must have had a misreading of the Old Testament, if she had read it, to think, if I touch his garment, I will be made well, because Haggai is saying, no, it doesn't work that way. However, she's heard reports about Jesus, right? She's heard reports that Jesus isn't like other prophets. He's not like other priests. He's not like other kings. Jesus is altogether different. And she had heard reports, perhaps even about the leper, with the same situation, that Jesus reaches out and touches the leper, and instead of Jesus becoming defiled, the leper is healed, is cleansed. Also, perhaps she had also read Malachi 4. And Malachi 4, he says, in this messianic prophecy, says, when the Son of Righteousness shall rise with healing in its wings. The Son of Righteousness shall rise with healing in its wings, the wings of the garment. The Son of Righteousness, talking about Jesus, when he comes up, he will have healing in his wings. And as this woman reached out to touch the garment, to touch the robe, to touch the wing, what happens? She is healed. We see this in verse 29. And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And it was at this point that Jesus stopped. He was going with Jairus, and it was at this moment when Jesus stopped and said, who touched me? And we go on in verse 30-33 again. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, who touched my garments? And his disciples said to him, you see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, who touched me? And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And notice that this woman assumes the same posture of the winds and the waves a few stories back, where Jesus stands up and he tells it to be quiet, and what do the winds and the waves do? They fall down before him, and there's a peace. She takes the same posture as the demon-possessed man who, when he saw Jesus, runs to him and falls down before him. She takes the same posture that Jairus had when he saw Jesus. He runs to Jesus and falls down. And now this woman who had reached out and touched Jesus, when pointed out, she comes forward and she falls down before him. I mean, culturally speaking, Jesus had every right to curse this woman and send her away. He could have had her arrested. He could have humiliated her in front of everyone. This unclean woman bringing her defilement to the feet of Jesus, hoping to be healed. What nerve. But this is the gospel story. We are an unclean people, and what do? We run to the feet of Jesus. And we fall down before him with all of our sin and defilement and death, and we reach out to touch him that we might be healed. This is the story of the gospel. This is the hope of the gospel. So how does Jesus respond? We see this in verse 34. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. Be healed of your disease." I love this. He calls her daughter. Daughter, he says. He doesn't call her woman. He doesn't call her outcast or some defiled woman. He calls her a daughter. You see that the power of this statement is life-changing, right? He calls her daughter. Not only does he heal her, not only does he not cast her out, but he actually brings her in to the family of God. He brings her in to his people, to his covenant community. He calls her daughter. And after that, he says, and he saw her faith, and your faith has made you well. And the way we should understand this is the faith that she had was the conduit in which Christ used to make her well. All glory goes to God, not into the level of her belief. But she had faith in Jesus. He's the one I must go to. So after telling her that her faith has made her well, he then sends her off with peace, or shalom. There's a lot of Old Testament imagery here of shalom, peace be with you. This is a holistic, life-changing peace that is only found in relationship with God. And this he gives her. Peace be with you, you are healed. Peace be with you, and you are healed. This is a powerful benediction. This is a covenantal benediction, sending her out with peace, shalom, and healing. Peace and healing are only found in one place. Though she searched for it at all these different doctors, all these different physicians, ultimately it was found only at one place. And it is only found for us at one place, and that is the person of Christ. He is the only one that brings peace to the chaos. He is the only one that brings healing to our brokenness. And ultimately, it is at the cross that we see peace and healing being handed out in abundance. It is only at the cross where racial tensions that divide so many people will be healed. It's only at the cross that family feuds will be laid to rest. It is only at the cross that the internal struggles that we have, that we struggle with, that keep us up at night, it's only at the cross that we will receive peace and healing. In fact, Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, mentions this again explicitly in verse 5 of chapter 53. Isaiah 53, speaking about Jesus, another messianic prophecy. He says in verse 5, "But he was pierced for our transgressions," talking about the cross. "He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that what? That brought us peace. And with his wounds we are healed." It is only at the cross that we find peace and healing. So Jesus sends this woman off with this covenantal benediction of peace, healing, and adoption. You're now mine. You are my daughter. It is only there that we move forward, that this woman can move forward with the shalom of life, right? Having this peace of life, knowing that she has been saved, she has been healed, and she has been brought in to the presence and the covenant of God. And as Jesus is talking to this woman, as she is now receiving this benediction of adoption and peace and healing, Jairus is still a nervous wreck. And the news is about to get a lot worse for Jairus. We see this in verse 35. While he was still speaking, this is Jesus speaking to the woman, there came from the ruler's house some who said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" Why trouble Jesus any further? Your daughter has died. As Jesus heals and blesses the woman, a blessing, a healing, an adoption, maybe 100 yards, maybe a mile, we're not sure how far away, but as he's doing this, this little girl dies. So why did Jesus ignore Jairus to deal with the woman? I mean, Jairus got there first. I'm sure this would be going on in his mind. How could this happen? I came first. I asked you first, Jesus. He begged him to come and heal his little girl. Jesus even knew that his daughter was at the point of death. Yet he stops to help this woman who could have waited. This lady had been suffering this way for 12 years. She could have waited another hour or two. Why would Jesus allow this to happen? It would be like for one of us if your child was sick, very sick, to the point of death, and you run out to the car, you put this child in the car, and you speed off to the ER, running every red light, panicked, discouraged, frustrated, concerned, thinking, if I don't get her to the doctor, she's going to die. And you run in with her in your arms, and you tell the nurse or the doctor, whoever checks you in, this is my daughter, she's about to die. The nurse says, yes, she is. We'll bring her in here. The doctor will be right in. It's like, oh my gosh, do I really have to wait? Like, get him in here now. And then the doors open, and you see the doctor start walking, not as quickly as you would like, and you're panicking because your child is about to die. And then this little girl with a runny nose taps him on the shoulder or on the leg and says, can you help me? And the doctor stops from his pursuit to your child and turns to this little girl with a runny nose and says, yeah, sure, what's going on? And so they start talking, and he goes to the medicine cabinet, gets the medicine, gives it to her, and then the girl sneezes. Oh, my goodness, let me go get you a tissue. And you're sitting there just, oh, my gosh, what about my child? What about my daughter? And then they come back, and they continue to talk, and then the nurse checks the vitals on your child, and she died, as this doctor was dealing with this girl with a runny nose. Like, could you imagine the rage and the frustration? This is what lawsuits are from, right? Is everybody wants to sue the hospital because of malpractice. This is not right. Jesus, how could you do this? How could you leave this little girl in order to save this woman who could have waited? At this point, anger, grief, frustration would have been overwhelming to Jairus. Yet Jesus overhears what his servant said to him. And in verse 36 and 37, we see this. He says, but overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, Jairus, do not fear, only believe. And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. So Jesus tells Jairus, oh, don't fear, just believe. It's like, okay, that feels kind of like a token, I hope you feel better, sort of statement. He just got news his child died. And Jesus says, don't fear, only believe. Jesus says, come on, we'll go. And this time he tells the crowd, you're staying here. And he takes the 3 disciples and Jairus, and they head off to Jairus' house. And this is now, we began with Jairus, we went into the woman with the issue of blood, and now we're coming to the backside of that sandwich where we pick up on the story of Jairus again. So look with me, if you would, at verses 38 through 40. They came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue. And Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he had entered, he said to them, why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping. And they laughed at him. But he put them all outside, and took the child's father and mother, and those who were with him, the 3 disciples, and went where the child was. So something that would often happen when somebody in a family, particularly a family with some money, when a child or a family member would die, these professional mourners would come in, right? These were people who would go to people's homes, and they would weep and cry loudly so everybody around knew what had happened. This would be similar to like a funeral with the limousines going from the church to the grave site, right? Everybody knows that somebody has just died. This is a way of honoring them. So these professional mourners would come in and weep and cry loudly in a very dramatic sort of way. So Jesus steps into the house, and he tells them, why are you making such a commotion? She's not dead. She's only sleeping. And these professional mourners, now, they turn their mourning into laughing, right? They start laughing at Jesus, saying, listen, we do this for a living. We know when somebody has died. So he takes these professional mourners and says, all right, you need to step out. Now he takes the mother and the father, Jairus, and his disciples, and walks in to the little girl's room. So when Jesus says that the girl is sleeping and that she is not dead, this is an interesting phrase here. What Jesus is referring to is, I'm going to wake her up as if she was sleeping. All right? The girl was, in fact, dead. And he does a similar thing in the story of Lazarus in John chapter 11. Lazarus, a friend of Jesus who had died, Jesus gets the news, and this is what he says. After saying these things, he said to them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awake him. The disciples, kind of being puzzled by this statement, says, Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will recover. You don't need to go there. Now, Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought that he meant taking a rest and sleep. All right, so Jesus is saying, listen, I'm going to treat this person. You're going to think they were only sleeping after I get done with them. All right, so he walks in and says, he told Jairus already, believe, have faith, don't be afraid. And now he walks into the house and says she's only sleeping. Now, Jairus and the mom might be kind of, did we make the right choice? Because Jesus seems out of touch with reality right now. First of all, his priorities were not straight when it came to the woman and the daughter, right? Priorities were messed up. He should have gone right to the girl. Now, he comes in and he's trying to tell everybody that our daughter, who is clearly dead, is only sleeping. So after saying these things, Jesus walks into the room with the family, with the disciples, and continues. And this next verse, I think, is one of the most beautiful, sweet, tender verses in the Bible. Jesus, who is the source of all power, of all might, the creator of all things, when he comes back, it says he's going to come back with fire in his eyes. He's the one, when he shows up, demons go running, kings fall down in fear. By the word of his mouth, the seas calm. This Jesus, creator of all, the sovereign ruler, walks into this room, and his words show that he's not only all-powerful, sovereign, has dominion over all things, but this shows his love, his gentleness, and his sensitivity. In verse 41, he walks into the room, and it says, taking her by the hand, taking her by the hand, he said to her, Talitha Kumi, which means, little girl, I say to you, arise. Talitha Kumi. Mark, for some reason, keeps the original Aramaic in this, right? This is not Greek as Mark wrote it in. It's clearly not English. He keeps the original Aramaic, and he does so for a reason. This is the most intimate, sensitive thing a father could possibly say to his daughter. This would be like Jesus walking in and saying, all right, sweetheart, it's time to get up. Just super kind. It would be what we might do with our little ones if they're sleeping. It's all right, baby, come on, get up, get up. That's exactly what he did. He walked in, and Talitha Kumi, come on, sweetheart, get up. He takes her by the hand, and she gets up. So Jesus takes her by the hand and says, sweetheart, come on, get up. And in verse 42, and immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age. And they were immediately overcome with amazement. So Jairus and his wife, along with Peter, James, and John, were all absolutely floored, overcome in amazement. How did this just happen? Jesus walks into the room, touches this dead girl again, something that would be ceremonially unclean for him to do, that would defile Jesus, but instead Jesus reverses this whole thing, touches her, and life flows from himself to this girl in the same way that life went from himself to the woman who touched his garment. So he picks up this little girl by the hand, says, come on, get up. And his family is floored. His disciples are floored, and her family is floored. This would be hard to process if you're a Jairus, right? The last couple hours of your life. You go from this state of desperation to absolute grief to total amazement. And this is what happened with Jairus, right? He He goes to Jesus as a desperate man, needing some help. He gets it, and he's nervous, he's anxious, he's trying to get to his girl, and then he gets news that his girl had died. That desperation crashes to grief. And grieving father, not sure what to make of this whole situation, walks back into the room where the girl is, and Jesus says, "Come on, sweetie, get up." And the girl comes back to life, and now he's overcome with amazement. This is a powerful story for us. This is a powerful story for the disciples, because this sets the tone, in a sense, for what's to come and the hope that they have in the future for when Jesus goes to the cross. But again, focusing in on Jairus, he went to Jesus, reckless abandon. I'm going to forget everything that I know. I'm going to forget my reputation, and I'm going to go to Jesus, and I want a healing. But what Jesus gave him instead was a resurrection. And this is what happens with us. We go to Jesus saying, "I need to be healed." But what does he give us ultimately but a resurrection? The girl, the woman with the issue of blood, she went to Jesus for a healing, but what did she get? She got an adoption. She got shalom. And ultimately, she's going to get a resurrection as well. These two stories work together to show us the beautiful reality of the gospel. And they work together both in complement and contrast on multiple different levels. We see some of the complements of these two stories where both of the women, the little girl and the woman with the issue of blood, both are referred to as daughter. Both the woman and the little girl were ceremonially unclean. Both the woman and the little girl were made well by Jesus' touch. The woman had an issue of blood for 12 years. The little girl was 12 years old. Again, linking them together. This number also, in a sense, links them to the nation of Israel and the uncleanliness that they had been living in, the 12 tribes and so on. Both the woman and the little girl ultimately are healed by Jesus. We see a lot of similarities in these two stories, but then we see contrast. Jairus is a man of status, wealth, privilege. He's a ruler of the synagogue. He's a public figure, respected by all. He had a family. He had a home. He had servants. The text gives us Jairus' name, where the woman remains unnamed. The woman is an outcast. She has no social status or privilege. The woman had a physical disease that left her as an outsider. She's unclean, polluted, untouchable. The woman had no money, for she had spent all of her money. She had no home because she couldn't afford a home. She had no one to speak for her as Jairus spoke for his daughter. We see that Jairus comes to Jesus in public and asks Jesus in front of everyone to heal his daughter. Yet afterwards, in this last verse, we see that Jesus tells him to keep it quiet. The woman comes to Jesus in secret, yet she's brought into the light. This is the paradox of the Christian faith, right? The way up is down. The humble will be exalted. The lowly will be made great. What we find in this story is that Jesus' love is not based on social status. His love is for all people, whether a demon-possessed Gentile living in a graveyard, or a woman who had been sick for 12 years, or a little girl who had just passed away. Jesus is not a respecter of person. He doesn't overlook the woman because this important man has asked him to help him. This probably would have gone well for Jesus if he would have just stayed with Jairus and smoothed with him a little bit and kind of got the pressure off from the religious leaders. Yet he puts him to the side and deals with this woman who had no social privilege, no right to have Jesus' attention in this day. This story demonstrates God's love for all people. It demonstrates his power that is at work not only in their lives, but in our lives today. And there's one more aspect of this story I want to show you. So at the very last verse, and after the resurrection of the little girl, Jesus gives the mom and dad some instruction in verse 43. It says, "And he strictly charged them that no one should know this. And he told them to give her something to eat." It's kind of like, wow, that's an anticlimactic way to end this story, Mark. Why did you do it that way? right? You could have had this triumphal, you walk out of the house and everybody cheers and you show yourself to be king, but instead he says, listen, don't tell anybody what happened and give her some food. The reason he says don't tell anyone is because if they spread the news that Jesus just raised a little girl from the dead, he would have been persecuted all the more by the Pharisees and the scribes. And Jesus wasn't ready to go to the cross yet. It wasn't his time. So he told them to keep it quiet so that he wouldn't be arrested and taken as a demon-possessed man like they tried to charge him in chapter 3. But instead he says, keep it quiet. And then he says, give this little girl something to eat. This gives us a great vision for the Christian hope, right? This verse offers us great Christian hope. He told them to give her something to eat. What he does not tell them, he does not tell the mom and dad to really consider the transcendent nature of the Almighty God. He does not tell them to consider how the laws of reality and Yahweh himself incarnate meet together and he brings a child back from the dead. He does not give them a sermon on how he is the fulfillment of prophecy. Jesus keeps it very practical. He says, give her something to eat. So why is this? Why does Mark end with this statement? Why does he say, give her something to eat when he could have done so many other things? Well, I think there's two reasons. One, she was hungry, right? The girl was hungry. She was just dead. And now she's back to life, and she needs some food. Very real. Her stomach probably hurt a little bit. Said, give her some food. She's real. She's alive. She's not a ghost. Let her eat. And we see this often. For whatever reason, when there's resurrections in the Bible, they're hungry when they come back from the dead. Jesus being a perfect example. So she was probably hungry. But also, Jesus puts this at the end, or Mark puts this at the end of the story because eating always follows resurrection, right? Eating, feasting always follows resurrection. This is the Christian hope. Isaiah 25, verses 6 through 9, he says this, on the mountain, the Lord of hosts will make for all peoples a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wine, of rich food full of marrow, of aged wine well refined. And he will swallow up on this mountain. This mountain refers to the new heavens and the new earth, this new creation, okay? This is following the resurrection. And he will swallow up on this mountain the covering that casts over all peoples, the veil that has spread over all nations. This covering, this veil, is referring to the curse of sin and death. He will swallow it up. Verse 8, he says, he will swallow up death forever, and the Lord God will wipe away tears from all faces. And the reproach of his people, the reproach, that unclean aspect, the ceremonially defiled, this reproach that we have before God, and the reproach of his people will be taken away from the earth. For the Lord has spoken. It will be said on that day, behold, this is our God. We have waited for him, that he might save us. This is the Lord. We have waited for him. Let us be glad and rejoice in his salvation. Jesus has come, and by these actions, the touching of the leper, the healing of the woman with the issue of blood, by touching a dead little girl, what he is doing is swallowing up death. He is swallowing up the curse. He's taking within himself all the defilement that separates these people, that separate us from God. And by doing so, by swallowing it up, he is giving life to his people. Jesus is showing us in this woman and in this little girl that what he will do ultimately for everyone on that last day. He is showing how on the cross he will swallow up death, and how in the second coming he will wipe away every tear from every eye. He is showing us that on the second coming there will be a resurrection to new life, and how after this resurrection we will feast with Jesus. We will feast on rich food and well-aged wine. There's a feast that follows resurrection. He's telling the parents to feed the little girl because that's exactly what you do after you are raised from the dead. You feast. This is the circle of life, right? We are born, we are dead, we are raised, and we feast. And that's not only the circle of life overall, but that's how we live out our lives as well, even spiritually speaking. We are born, and then we die to ourselves. We die. We are crucified with Christ so that we might be raised with him. And then we feast. We feast with him in his new kingdom, in his creation. We are born, we die, we're raised, and we feast. And that's why at our church we come to the communion table every week. Because each week we have a dying to self. And each week there is a resurrection that takes place. And each week we come before God and we say, God, you remember your covenant with us. You remember what you have done. You saw that we were dead. You brought us back to life. And now we feast. We eat this. If we could, I would love to have a huge feast every week where we had communion together with a full meal. That would be awesome. But this is just a foretaste of what's to come. Because in that new creation, when we are finally raised, when we are finally with him in all glory and all defilement, all sin, all death, all tears are gone, we will sit down at the marriage supper of the Lamb and we will feast with Christ. So think about this. When we come up this morning for communion, that you are feasting with Jesus and he is remembering what he has done for you. Even if your mind is kind of scattered this morning and unsure of what to say, what to confess, or anything like that, don't worry about that. The scriptures say to discern the body. And what he means by that is to say if there's anything going on among you, if there's any unresolved tension, any forgiveness or confession that needs to happen, let that happen because we don't eat together in the midst of conflict. We eat together in light of the resurrection, unified in him. And we do this reminding God of what he has done for us. So think of these things. Think about the power of the gospel. Think of the hope that we have and how this meal signifies that hope.